If you walked into a game station in the early 2000s, you knew exactly where you were. While its rivals were trying to turn video games into a clean, family-friendly commodity, GameStation felt like a clubhouse. It was the only place on the high street where the staff would ignore the latest FIFA release to talk to you about a rare Dreamcast import they'd just taken in. But the reality is that for most of its life, GameStation was a pawn in a high-stakes financial game that had nothing to do with gaming. This would eventually lead to its catastrophic downfall. Founded in York in 1993 by Stephen Hall and Julian Gladwin, GameStation started with a simple, distinct philosophy: value and variety. They understood that gamers wanted the new shiny thing as well as old stuff. By the late 90s, they'd established a headquarters at Sterling Park in York and were filing healthy returns. By the financial year ending April 2001, the company was posting a pre-tax profit of over £600,000. It was a financially viable, fast-growing machine built on the passion of its founders. But success in retail is blood in the water for corporate sharks. In October 2002, everything changed. Blockbuster, the American video rental giant, was looking for a way to dominate the games market. They decided the fastest way to do it was to buy the competition. On October 10th, 2002, Blockbuster UK Limited acquired the entirety of GameStation. The shift was immediate, with co-founder Julian Gladwin resigning, paving the way for the corporate suits to come in and take control. Under Blockbuster, the strategy was aggressive, reckless expansion. In 2003 alone, they nearly doubled the shop count from 72 to 139. They were opening shops everywhere, often aggressively positioning them right next to their main rival, Game. But this aggressive expansion came at a cost. In 2005, despite the massive footprint, the company swung to a pre-tax loss of £2.2 million. However, in 2006, just a year later, they turned the ship around with profit of £2.36 million. So GameStation wasn't a failing business when it was sold for the final time. It was a profitable powerhouse that had fixed its issues and was making serious money, and that is exactly why it was doomed. That's because it was tethered to a dying brand, Blockbuster. The rental market was collapsing, and they needed cash desperately. They sold GameStation because it was the only asset they had that was actually worth anything. In May 2007, Game Group plc bought GameStation for £74 million. It seemed like a monopoly was forming, but the Office of Fair Trading cleared the deal, accepting the argument that competition for video game sales still existed from supermarkets and the internet. It was a fatal misjudgment. When Game took over on May 2, 2007, they immediately installed their own directors, including their UK managing director, Nicholas Shepherd. The narrative sold to the public was one of dual branding. They promised that GameStation would remain separate, catering to the hardcore gamer, while Game focused on the mass market. But behind the scenes, the integration began immediately. In November 2008, Game transferred the online trade of GameStation to their own accounts. They stripped the GameStation entity of its digital future. The dual brand strategy resulted in a bizarre high street cannibalism. You would often have a Game and a GameStation 3 doors apart, paying 2 sets of rent, 2 sets of business rates, and 2 sets of staff wages, all to sell the same copy of Call of Duty to the same customer base. In a booming economy, this might have been sustainable, but the economy wasn't booming. The 2008 crash had decimated consumer spending, and the lease obligations were becoming a noose around the company's neck. By 2010, they had operating lease commitments of nearly £13.8 million per year just to keep their physical shops open. They were locked into long-term contracts for shops that were seeing footfall drop every single month. The clubhouse vibe was replaced by a desperate drive for upsells. Staff were pressured to push disc protection warranties and loyalty cards on customers who just wanted to buy a used game. The culture that Stephen Hall and Julian Gladwin had built was being suffocated by the desperate need to service the liabilities of the parent company. Aside from the shop leases, this also included a massive pile of debt. That's because when Game acquired GameStation in 2007, they used debt. And crucially, they used GameStation's own assets to secure that debt. This is a common but dangerous practice in the corporate world known as a leveraged buyout. Essentially, GameStation was forced to mortgage its own future to pay for the privilege of being bought by its rival. GameStation's assets were all pledged as security. This meant that when the market turned, GameStation had no wiggle room. They were chained to the fortunes of the wider Game Group, which was struggling under the weight of its own international expansion and the global recession. The specific tragedy here is that GameStation was arguably the healthier brand. It had better customer loyalty and a stronger grip on the pre-owned market, which is where the real profit margins are. The situation became critical in early 2012. The video game cycle was at a low point. The PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 were aging, and consumers were waiting for the next generation of consoles. Sales were down across the board, but the death blow came from the supply chain. In the retail world, credit is oxygen. Retailers don't pay for games up front. They typically pay 60 or 90 days later. This relies on credit insurers, companies that insure the publishers against the retailer going bust. In February 2012, the credit insurers looked at Game Group's balance sheet, saw the £100 million rent bill and the massive bank debt, and pulled the plug. They refused to insure the stock. The result was immediate chaos. Electronic Arts, Nintendo, and Capcom refused to ship new titles. Mass Effect 3, the biggest game of the quarter, didn't appear on the shelves of GameStation. Street Fighter Cross Tekken was nowhere to be seen. Customers who had pre-ordered games months in advance were told they wouldn't be getting them. The trust evaporated overnight. On March 26, 2012, the inevitable happened. The Game Group plc and its subsidiaries, including GameStation Limited, entered administration. PricewaterhouseCoopers was appointed to pick apart the carcass. The immediate toll was horrific. The very next day, 277 shops were closed. In towns across the UK, staff arrived at work to find the shutters down and a generic notice taped to the glass. The selection process for which shops survived was purely mathematical. If a GameStation shop was more profitable than the game shop down the road, it stayed. If it wasn't, it went. In many locations, however, profitable GameStation shops were closed simply because the lease on the nearby game shop was harder to exit. A savior came in the form of Op Capita, a private investment firm that had set up a special purpose vehicle called Baker Acquisitions to buy the assets. They bought the remaining 333 shops out of administration for a fraction of their value. The new owners, though, were ruthless realists. They looked at the dual brand strategy and saw inefficiency. Why pay for 2 sets of marketing? Why maintain 2 websites? Why have 2 shop designs? They decided to unify everything under the Game brand. In September 2012, the announcement was made. GameStation was dead. Martin Gibbs, the CEO of the New Game Retail Limited, and ironically, a man who had served as a director of GameStation back in 2008, issued a statement promising that the GameStation ethos would live on. He claimed the new game shops would feature the best of both brands. The rebranding process was pretty straightforward. The distinctive signage was ripped down. The darker industrial interiors were painted over with clinical white and purple. The Fat Chris character, the emblem of GameStation's marketing, was retired, and the retro community feel was sanitized. The retro sections in the new shops had a small shelf of overpriced PS2 games tucked in a corner, which eventually disappeared altogether. The collapse of GameStation represented the moment when the UK games industry shifted from a hobbyist, enthusiast-run sector to a purely corporate one. But what do you reckon? Were you a loyal GameStation regular who refused to step foot in a game shop? Or do you think looking back with rose-tinted glasses makes the place seem better than it actually was? Maybe you were even one of the staff members who had to sit through that awkward transition period. If so, we'd definitely love to hear your side of the story. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the business of gaming history, give us a like, hit subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Cheers for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.